Did you want to quickly test your screen share now?
Do you want me to screen share right now?
Just test it. Hello. Did you want to quickly test your screen share?
You may want to mute YouTube, Jonathan.
I know. I was just setting it up. So for those who just joined us, we'll be starting at 7:15. Have you managed to get that to share, Pedro?
Yes, let's go. I deployed my presentation, so that's the easy part. So, all right, let me put it on full screen. All right, share my screen and then Google Chrome and share. Can you see it?
Yeah, that's
perfect.
All right, so as everybody knows, like there are some weird parts.
Pedro, we're just testing for now.
All right.
Sorry. Yeah.
So let me just go to all of them and yeah.
Oh, I like your breadcrumbs.
Yeah, the Pac-Man.
Hi, Dylan.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Hello. Yeah, we can.
Good.
How are you?
I'm good. I am just getting going here.
Checking who's working, the YouTube stream, the thing here.
Yeah, nice.
Pedro, if you stop sharing, Dylan can also test it works.
All right.
I like how you still have your half stack thing behind you.
So behind me, I have a big 8-foot by 8-foot whiteboard where I have like all the details about my company that I'm working on, which is kind of, so like I better pop out the half stack banner and block that off today.
Sure.
Otherwise you'll get my like super secret stealth mode ideas, you know. Aren't really that stealthy, but it's just kind of funny.
Sure.
So you want me to share? Is that, sorry, I didn't hear.
Just to test it's working properly.
Okay, cool. Yep, let's see.
You know what technology is like?
Yep. Just remember to hide a couple things. Give me like 20 seconds or so. How's that look?
Yeah, it looks really good. Really crisp as well.
Got some prints from 1999.
Don't give us too many spoilers.
Okay, I'll save it. I'll save it. Cool.
How is the weather in Phoenix today?
We have the hottest summer on record. Today is roughly the 50-somethingth day we're over 110 Fahrenheit, which is like 43 or 44 C. We measure days by how many days, hotness by how many days it is over 110. Usually it's about 10 or 15 days, and this summer is like 50 something. It's just been nonstop repressive.
I'm gonna have to Google what 110 is in Celsius.
No, it's like 40, 43 or 44. It's right around there.
Okay, yeah, that's hot.
Yeah.
They were saying it was going to be nearly 50 tomorrow, but I think we got a relief from that. Let's see what it is today.
Yeah,
it's only 44 again. Today.
Only 44. Wow.
Yeah. So yeah, 44 is like 111, right? Yeah, there you go. Yep.
So you're in Dubai.
Phoenix, Arizona. Yeah, but basically Dubai without the humidity.
So when I was in Florida last year, that was during a heat wave, and that was horrible.
Yeah, well, Florida is also pretty humid, so it's kind of awful.
While it happens in Brazil, that should be like a hot country, we hit our record for coldness like yesterday, I guess. It was the coldest night in like 28 years yesterday.
Well, that's the thing about climate change. It's more extreme. It's not just like warm. It's also extreme cold and other crazy things like unexpected hurricanes in the middle of land in America a couple weeks ago.
Yeah. I don't have that at least. Like, yeah.
I'm joining you in Disney.
Oh,
Jonathan.
thank you.
Nice. So which Disney is that? I took my son to Tokyo Disney in February, and it was an
That's
interesting
Paris,
experience.
right? It's Pink Castle.
This one is Paris, yeah.
Yeah.
And yours is Florida, Jonathan?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Which one's your favorite, Jonathan?
Florida is way better than Paris. Like,
I've only been to this one.
the only thing is Paris has a better version of Rocky Roller Coaster.
Yeah.
The American version is going down the freeway, but because when they try to translate it to UK, we don't have freeways. They then turn they're going through a rock concert, and and it's incredible the UK version, sorry, Paris version. But annoyingly, it's gone because they closed it and replacing it with Iron Man.
Right.
Ooh.
Yeah, I went to I grew up going to the one in California all the time, so that's kind of the original to me. But I took my son to the one in Tokyo because we were there for TSConf, which got canceled, so we went to Disney for the day instead. And it's really weird going on all the Disney rides when they're in Japanese and you have no idea what's being said. So like, Pirates of the Caribbean just sounds like some really angry like people screaming at each other, and you have no idea why.
Yeah, I think it's funny in Paris where it's 50-50. Like you go one time you go through it's English, and the next time it's in French.
Oh, nice. That's cool.
Yeah, they alternate. Natalie, do you want to check your screen sharing works?
Sorry, what was that?
Do you want to check your screen sharing's working?
Oh, yeah, sure.
We gave Natalie the night off from organising this event.
Yeah.
I made us talk instead.
Nice.
Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Yes.
Cool. Great. I will stop.
Cool.
Remind me of the rough schedule, Jonathan.
Okay, so the first talk will be Natalie, starting at 7:15. Hers is just a short 10-minute talk. We're going to do just like you did at Half Stack. We're then going to do 10 minutes of questions. Then start the next talk. That's a 20-minute talk. Then the 10 minutes questions, and then your talk. And then right at the end, we'll do we'll do a spin wheel thing to give away tickets to FemTechConf.
Cool.
Because yeah, we're sponsoring that this year.
Nice.
So, and Natalie's speaking at that as well.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, I tend to make you start talking.
Yeah, no, it's all good. Yeah, like I gave myself an extra 2 months for the second Half Stack Online, and I have not used it wisely. So I'm still kind of just starting to think through like I've got some speakers, but I just basically used it to procrastinate an extra 2 months.
Like I was thinking here, am I the only one that doesn't put like a lot of images and code in my presentation? Like every time I'm gonna present something, I always think that if I put like code in there, people will think like, oh, that's boring. I'm not gonna even.
I usually try to have one slide of code. And the reason for that is for effect. In this case, like I'm showing the original code from the very first TypeScript demo ever done. And it's kind of shocking what it looked like. So that's why I'm including it. But it doesn't really matter. But like there's jQuery in there and there's like all sorts of weird stuff. So it's kind of funny. But that's it in terms of code in my talk. And I think people just do what works for them, you know. It doesn't really matter too much. As long as you're having fun, the audience will enjoy it.
Oh yeah, all right. It's
Yeah.
like it's like the fourth presentation that I do like this, and that I never put like code in there. The only time that I added code was when I talked about what was it, like tests that I had to demonstrate like how to create them. And I had to like
Yeah.
create one of, but like there are some people that create like whole environments for their presentation and they put like code editors inside of it.
I mean, at that point, it's almost more like a tutorial or a workshop, and that's different than a conference talk or a keynote.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, I actually literally built the code editor into my slide deck there for my.
I know you did. Yeah.
I literally built the code editor myself.
Yep.
It's super fun. It's all open source now, though. Dylan, I've made all open source, which is good.
Awesome.
The only annoying thing is the style, because of the way I styled it, it only worked with the last version of Spectacle, not the new version. It's hard. It's annoying.
So I guess these lights are fun. I have these fun, cool, as you know, Jonathan, these fun, cool LED lights in my ceiling that I added for fun. So I can do like, you know, the party theme is probably everyone's favorite.
When I was
Whoa.
picking pixels,
It's got like all these like 10 of them in the
Whoa.
ceiling, and you can like they're Wi-Fi LED programmable, so it makes it more fun.
when I was
Puts
getting
me in the mood.
your pictures for the presentation for the slide deck, I saw something really cool you had on your Twitter, Dylan. You had the
Yes.
6 feet away mask.
Yes. Oh, it's in my it's in my car, but I have the mask and it's LED programmable. It's like
Also,
a
you
little
wear
mini
that
Arduino.
outside.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's pretty cool.
And it is all right. So when I go to like the market, I'm like a supermodel because everyone's just staring at like the mask, and it almost defeats the purpose. Like people are trying to come up and talk to me, and I'm like, back off, man. You know, like it's all good. And people are like randomly photobombing me and just weird. You know, it's very different. So it's pretty cool. It's fun. If you've not seen what I'm talking about, go to. She spoke at the Half Stack Online that we had in May. But she normally does fashion design, but she like started doing masks. And so it's the one in the middle that the LED matrix face mask, but it's really fun. And the app is kind of crap, but at least you can put whatever you want on it if you can draw pixel stuff on a screen. So I usually have Super Mario Brothers going across mine animated, like Mario's kind of bouncing up and down, trying to get a mushroom. And just kind of wear that around everywhere. Yeah.
Cool. We'll give people a couple more minutes to join, and then I'll start it. Because Aris made JS Monthly London Clash this week, but so we just got time so that we finish afterwards, so people can actually we'll start afterwards, so people can join.
That's good. Yeah. Yeah, in Phoenix, we're trying to get all the JavaScript meetups to just combine into one mega meetup group because it's exhausting to like have to have something all the time. And like we could schedule 5 meetups in a month if we want to, but the idea is just have one big group that everyone subscribes to rather than like 20 micro groups, because it allows us to like coordinate a little better and try to not collide so much.
Yeah, the reason we started this one because actually there was no events for a while in London because of COVID, right? So we were like,
Yeah.
okay, we'll start. We were starting to host events like JS Monthly, and we decided to start this one because of no events. Yeah, me, Natalie, and Ricardo all had the same idea simultaneously. And we were like, hey, and then we all started talking to each other.
Yeah, no, it's really fun. And honestly, it's a lot less effort than going to like a meetup every night. So it's nice to be able to do it. And it's cool to like be able to attend, you know, a London event from Phoenix without having to actually fly over for it.
Yeah, I've been speaking to someone in Seattle about maybe speaking next time.
Very cool.
What time is it where you are, Dylan?
It's 11:15 in the morning.
Nice.
So summer we're 8 hours behind, winter we're 7 hours behind. We don't believe in daylight savings time in Arizona because we have enough daylight to begin with. So
Yeah.
we don't change. Everyone else changes.
Yeah.
What about Brazil? What time is it?
In Brazil currently it's like 3:15
Yeah.
p.m. but like everything's closed. Only some constructions. Like I am on my sister apartment right now, as you can see. Like there's some like beautiful things that I
Yeah.
wouldn't have in my apartment, and she lives like on this like on the 20th floor, and
Oh,
we
wow.
can hear some constructions happening because suddenly I came here like last year and like there was nothing in the background, but now there are like 2 buildings coming up like on the 20th floor, and they are happening like really close to here.
Wow.
So it's like some noises can appear. I don't know if, because like at home I have a microphone that's called the Blue Yeti, the classic one.
Yeah.
But here I'm only using the one of the MacBook Pro 2020. So I don't know if
It's fine. I hear you well enough. Yeah. Yeah, the what we've discovered here is birds are a lot louder now. Like for whatever you hear things that you just wouldn't hear before, and it's interesting. But we've gone like 2 months ago. I think we were the worst in the world in Arizona for COVID cases, and then people finally started wearing masks, and now we're actually like it's not too bad here anymore, which is nice.
All right.
Cool. I'm going to have to interrupt this lovely conversation about masks, though, so that we can get started.
Go for it.
All right.
Cool. So let me unpause recording. I'll share my screen. Cool. Can everyone see my screen all right?
Yep.
Cool. Hi, I'm Jonathan. I'm here with my team from RVU to present our third Program the Pencil meetup. So like I said, we're sponsored by RVU. You can find us on Twitter at RVUEng. So your hosts tonight are myself, Jonathan. We have Zara, who's actually running a bit late, but she'll be joining us later, and my colleague Ricardo. So before we start, we want to tell you about a conference we're sponsoring. It's called FemTechConf. It's a women-focused conference in the tech industry, trying to obviously promote women in tech. It's a huge conference. They're expecting 30,000 attendees. So, as part of our involvement in the conference, we want to give away 5 tickets tonight. So if you just tweet us at RVUEng this evening, what we'll do is we'll put all the names of those people who tweeted us onto a spinning wheel, and then we'll give out 5 tickets at the end. Cool. So our first talk today is by my colleague Natalie. She's a developer that joined us earlier in the year at RVU, and what she's going to do is just to talk about going from her previous role in management consulting to software engineering. So over to you, Natalie.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen. Oh, so thanks, Jonathan. So it's my happy half-year anniversary working as a developer today. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about my journey from management consulting to my current role as a developer. I will touch on why I wanted to move, the research I had to do, and how I became comfortable with making such a big decision. So coming out of university where I studied psychology, I joined EY on their management consulting graduate scheme in their financial services technology division. I chose consulting because I thought it would give me a good, broad and solid foundation in business skills that would leave me with plenty of options if I did decide to do something else further down the line. I also liked the fact that it was project-based, so it meant I could move around and gain exposure to working with different types of businesses. So in my 3 years there, I acquired some great experience across financial services. I worked with investment banks, commercial banks, and wealth asset managers to roll out large-scale implementation programs and post-merger acquisitions. However, I didn't do a whole lot of technology, and I was starting to notice how bogged down by bureaucracy some of these big banks were, and how that often made them quite slow to adapt to change. At the same time, the industry was shifting. Unknown digital challenger banks were gaining market share and disrupting the industry with their innovative technology platforms that their customers really engaged with. They were small, agile, fast-paced, and I wanted experience of working in this kind of environment and to be part of the disruption. So I found a fintech through Silicon Milk Roundabout that helped small businesses to access funding through their own technology platform, and joined them as a project manager. I did have some doubts initially about moving from a big, safe corporate to a riskier venture, but I knew that at the worst, if things didn't work out, I could always go back to consulting. As expected, the fintech was a completely different environment. Things moved extremely quickly, and we were releasing new features literally week by week. It was also the first time that I was so close to seeing how a product was built from a technology perspective, and I became fascinated by it. In my role, I was always manually testing the customer journey, and I would often find myself reporting bugs to the developers and sitting with them to try and figure out what had caused these. There was something truly satisfying about the outcome of their work being so tangible. Also, in working with the developers to deliver projects, I realized there were significant gaps in my technical knowledge that I really wanted to fill. So I started exploring coding outside of work. My company gave us an annual learning budget, and I used part of it to do a weekend introduction to coding course at General Assembly. I also attended meetups and free coding workshops run by organizations such as CodeBar, LeWagon, Founders and Coders. And I was pleasantly surprised by how many free resources there are out there and how welcoming the community was to newbies like me. I was really enjoying learning to code and started to consider this as not only a useful skill to have, but something I could see myself possibly doing as a career. And along the way, I discovered Makers, a 4-month intensive coding bootcamp designed for people who want to change careers and get a job in software engineering. After doing my research and speaking to people in my network who had done Makers themselves, just over a year ago, I made the leap to hand in my resignation and go for the course. It was an amazing experience to go back to learning in such a hands-on environment with people from all backgrounds and different stages of their career and life. I was in a cohort with people who had just graduated from university to 50-year-olds who had worked in the same industry for 20 years and decided they wanted to change. And we all went from knowing only basic code to being able to build a full stack applications in just a few months. The other major benefit I found of doing a bootcamp was the support they provided with the job hunting process, as they held career fairs every month where their hiring partners would attend and speak to us. After my graduation, I attended one of these and applied to a couple of companies I met there and liked. And it was through this that I found RVU. So RVU felt like the perfect balance between a large company and a fast-growing startup, as they have a very entrepreneurial culture and spirit with a more mature business and platform behind them. Needless to say, I've not been disappointed by the level of support and learning opportunities that I've had since joining them. By day 3, I was already pushing changes to the code base live on the Uswitch site. And since then, I've worked on various projects ranging from rebuilding the careers website completely from scratch to working on new features for the broadband and energy journeys on our Uswitch website. I think on reflection, one of the hardest things about making a career change is dealing with the uncertainty and possibility of failure. But if you prepare well, then you can mitigate this so it feels less like jumping off a cliff. And so if I could distill my experience into 3 key steps or phases, it would look something like this. So the first phase is the exploration phase, understanding whether this is something you really want to do day in and day out, and just trying things out. I'm not saying that you have to build a whole website, but dabbling enough in it that you know that you enjoy it and want to do more of it. And going to meetups to meet developers and find out what it's like to work as a software engineer. So this phase is all about following your curiosity and being open to new opportunities. Then the second phase would be the research phase. So once you've decided that you want to pursue this path more seriously, then it's really important to understand all your options. So visit all the boot camps and attend their open days, and crucially speak to alumni to understand what you're letting yourself in for. So some of the key things to consider are: what is the reputation of the course among students and employers? What is the quality of the course content? And what languages will you learn? How is the teaching delivered? And does this style suit your learning? What is the completion rate like? Do many people drop out? Because if so, it suggests that there isn't really enough support on the course. How are they preparing you for working as a software developer in the real world? And where have they placed their graduates? Another thing that I would highly recommend doing is LinkedIn stalking people who have graduated from the boot camps to see where they're working now. So the third phase would be budgeting and saving. I would say you should almost do this in parallel with the research phase, because getting your finances in order is really important, as often there is a cost associated with making a career change. Even if you decide to do a free course like Founders and Coders, you may still have to quit your job and take time off to do it, which means potentially no income for at least 5 months, factoring in job hunting time. Switching careers requires a lot of focus, and you want to be able to commit fully without being distracted by financial worries. And finally, once you've done all this, then it's time for liftoff. When you're ready, just go for it and don't look back. I wouldn't wait longer than you need to, or you may put it off forever. I've seen people who've stayed self-teaching for years because they never feel like they're quite ready yet, or it's never the right time. I think that this framework can be applied not just to changing careers, but any major move that you make in your life, whether it be pursuing a passion or starting a new hobby, or even moving teams or departments within your company. It can definitely be scary to make a big change in your life, but one thing I've learned through all of this is to listen to your intuition and that inner voice. So I wanted to leave you with one of my favorite quotes from Sheryl Sandberg. What would you do if you weren't afraid? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalie. That was a really great talk. So I now get the honor of asking you some questions. So for those who haven't used Zoom before, it has an ability to post Q&A. There's a small button on the bottom bar that says Q&A. And what you can do is you can go in there and type a question. In the meantime, I've got a few questions. So I did tell Natalie I'd ask this, which is tabs or spaces.
I thought you were joking.
I don't joke about tabs or spaces.
So, well, I would just recommend using a linter. Yeah, that would auto indent your code for you, so you don't have to worry about that.
Fair enough. Good answer. Joking aside, though, like if someone has tried coding before and they found it really challenging, but really likes the idea of coding, what would you recommend for them?
I think that, yeah, that's a good question. I think I would. It depends how long they've been trying it for. But I think if they really loved it, then, you know, I think that they would be able to. They would be able to do well in it, because I do think coding is something you can learn. I think obviously some people have a natural sort of knack for it, but I do think it's not something that's impossible to learn. And so if you're committed enough and motivated enough, I definitely think it's not impossible. So yeah, I would recommend them just to sort of spend more time. There were lots of resources that I found helpful when I was starting out. So Code Academy was a good resource that I found when I first started learning. And also I'd recommend that they go to really supportive communities and workshops such as CodeBar. So they're a not-for-profit organization that holds weekly sort of workshops where you can go and get paired with mentors, and essentially for the whole time, 2 hours, you can just work with the mentor on whatever you want to work on, whatever projects you're working on, and get help there. So there are plenty of sort of resources out there that they could use.
Cool. So someone's posted a question in the Q&A. How do you keep up with rapidly changing technology?
Oh, it's a good question. Another good question. So yeah, I think that's it's tricky to be keeping up with technology because it's always changing and there are always new sort of frameworks coming out and new technologies coming out. But I guess I'm still continuing to go to meetups, even during the lockdown, sort of going to them. I think that's a good way as well because they often speak about sort of new technology there. And again, sort of at work as well, I'm exposed to sort of new technology, speaking with my colleagues too. And yeah, and generally sort of, I follow a few sort of blogs on Medium, and that's another good way, sort of reading blogs to keep up with changing technology.
Cool. I've got a great question from Jordan. It's a really interesting journey culturally. How have you found your career in development versus your time in consulting?
Yeah, so it's definitely, it has been definitely different. There are, I think, there certainly have been similarities. And I'd say, for example, the collaborative nature is fairly similar, but also as a developer, it definitely feels a lot more like you're working towards you're sort of you're united with your team in achieving the same goal. And it definitely does feel collaborative in a different way, because consulting was team-based. So there's similarity there, but yeah, and I guess with development, you're a lot more in the details, whereas consulting was quite high level. So yeah, it's very different there.
Cool. Tom Michaelis has asked a great question as well, which is, hey Natalie, you put a lot of thought into what you were looking for from your career change. Do you know if it's been a good choice yet? How would you suggest aspiring career changers assess the success of their choice?
Really good question. And so I think there are a couple of answers to that. The first part is yes, I know that it's been a good choice. And I think you can tell that pretty quickly. I think one, you can kind of feel it. And as I mentioned, your intuition kind of tells you whether you're enjoying something and whether it feels right or not. And I guess the other way that you can assess the success of your choice is by asking for feedback from your peers and your managers and people that you work with. That's definitely another good way to sort of assess how well you're doing in your career. And yeah.
Is there a piece of feedback you received in your past few months since you became an engineer that's really stuck with you and helped you?
Yeah, I think actually another thing that I've been quite surprised about, or pleasantly surprised about, having gone into developing, is how useful soft skills actually are, and how much they're sort of regarded. Because I think the sort of stereotype or the sort of impression that I had before I knew much about software engineering was that it was very technical, and sort of the soft skills were kind of less important. But actually, having sort of become a developer, I've realized they're sort of almost just as important as the technical side of things are. So, being able to communicate really well and work collaboratively with people from other disciplines is actually really important. And being able to sort of explain and what you're doing as well to non-technical people, is also sort of crucial.
Cool. How have you found working as a software engineer versus what you were expecting when learning or going through the bootcamp? And that's from Megan.
Yeah, so I think the bootcamp prepared me quite well for what working as a software engineer would be like. And that was definitely one of the reasons why I chose to do a bootcamp, because not just because of the languages that they taught you, but also because they taught you about the way of working as a software engineer. So there have definitely been some similarities in the way that I worked at the bootcamp. So we did, for example, we did plenty of team projects, and we would sort of do daily stand-ups and use sort of a board, a retro board, and have retrospectives. So that, yeah, I definitely didn't find it a big shock coming to work as a software engineer, because I'd already been exposed to kind of that agile way of working.
Cool. Does the way your team work significantly differ from consulting then? Like, what's the key difference in the way you work?
Absolutely. I think the nature of the work definitely differs a lot. So in consulting, we wouldn't have had sort of daily stand-ups, and we would have had team meetings, but there was, yeah, it wasn't as sort of communicative or structured. And we'd spend most of our day sort of working on slideshows or speaking to clients or in meetings, whereas as a developer you do, well, you code.
Cool. Is there any more questions from the audience? Because obviously I could ask questions all day. Okay, so we've got a question from Minty Yang. Did you start hunting for a job straight away after bootcamp? Did you feel prepared?
Yeah, so I pretty much went straight into job hunting after graduating. And did I feel prepared? Yes, yes and no. I think you always worry that you're not quite ready yet, or you're not prepared enough yet, or you haven't done, enough coding. But at the same time, the bootcamp prepares you quite well for this phase, and they've got a lot of support there to help you with the job hunting. So, for example, I think by week 5 or 6 of the course, I was already doing sort of tech reviews. So that was where you could have basically like a tech interview, a remote one with someone that you didn't know, and they would just watch you. They would ask you a sort of basic problem, and you'd have to solve it in front of them. So, and I think also week 10, we had just a whole week dedicated to doing sort of code tests. So we were definitely ready by the time it came to graduation. And they also had a whole careers team that helped us sort of with our CVs and preparing for interviews and things like that.
Cool. And this is going to be our last question, again from Tom. So clearly the careers fair stage of the bootcamp was really useful for you. Is there anything else the engineering community could have done to help career changers like yourself find your ideal job?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Because I think the community already does quite a lot for career changes, but they definitely do more from the aspect of helping people learn to code rather than necessarily helping them find a job. So potentially, there could be sort of like a jobs board that could help, or like a meetup that's specifically for sort of pairing employers with people looking to do career changes. I remember one really good meetup that I went to where they were pairing sort of people just starting out their careers with mentors in the industry. So potentially doing something like that for people who are yet to change their career yet would be quite useful.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that talk and answering all our questions. I'm going to hand over to Ricardo now, who will introduce our next speaker.
Thanks very much, Natalie. This was very interesting. So before we present Pedro, I just wanted to highlight that if you're interested in joining the FemTechConf, you can either post in Zoom or just tweet us, and we'll.
I think you've frozen, Ricardo.
Game development to public speaking.
I think
So-
you froze, Ricardo, so we didn't hear you.
Sorry, my internet is unstable. I just got a message.
So you start again. Start again.
Sorry. So what I was saying is, if you're interested in joining FemTechConf, just tweet us or post here in our Zoom chat. There's some pretty interesting speakers there. So things from Vue.js to how to speak in conferences to like game development. So there's some pretty cool stuff going on there. And I will present the slide deck in a second. Yeah. Cool. So our next speaker is Pedro Filho. He's coming straight from Brazil to talk about how we should start a side project. So you can take over, Pedro.
Hello, all right. Share, you cannot share screen while others are doing it. So, how can I present my screen? It's, yes, I'll just share. Okay, Google Chrome, share. All right, can you see it now? All right, so hello everyone, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about how to start a side project. And that's something that a lot of people ask me. So yeah, I'm here to talk a little bit about it. First of all, who am I? My name is Pedro Filho. I'm a software engineer at Google Analytics. It's a company that's basically like Google Analytics, but for games. We have like 2 billion users per month. It's a crazy amount of users. And I work there as a front-end engineer, and I help them to present this data to studios and game developers. So let's talk a little bit about this. And the real thing is that everyone has an idea. And I think that everyone has that friend that comes to you and says that he has the biggest idea of the century, and they want help to build that idea. And everyone thinks that that idea is the perfect one. But yeah, sometimes it's not. You have an idea, so what? The only thing that you have to do to fix that idea is do it, right? Well, sometimes not. Let's talk a little bit about how you can make like the idea that you have into something that is more concrete. I'm saying it because a lot of people like think about how to create an idea that allows to create like a project that is the next to-do app or the next Jira that everyone uses and has some complaints about it. And just one tip that I want to give here is to like live your life as a developer or as a non-tech person and try to feel the issues before you come with something. Sometimes you don't know a market and you want to create something that is already there, or you don't know it, or it's not going to fix anybody's issue, and it never works. Let's talk about like 3 simple steps so you can basically start your project. And independent if you are like a front-end engineer or a back-end engineer, if you want to create like the next perfect API for something, or if you want to create the next visual thing for something, or you're full stack and you know how to create something from scratch, it's always 3 steps. The number one is find problems worth solving. All right, yeah, this one I already said some stuff about it, but it's basically try to find issues that first, if you want to monetize it, trying to find issues that people would pay for it. Otherwise, you always find out that that issue that you thought that somebody would pay like $100 per month or $1 per month is not worth it. Like people will just use that other one, and it's going to be like a worth one to use. So try to find out if that market is not like is not already taken, and if it is, then come up with something really innovative, and you're on the top of the game. The second thing is, as I'm a front-end engineer and I kind of work as a full stack, some people in my teams, usually they don't have the expertise to work with the backend. And that's something that is not that, it's very recursive, like it happens a lot. Sometimes you only work with, I don't know, like React or Angular or Vue, and you don't know how to create an API, or you don't know how to build something to process data or something like that. And my tip here is to don't bother about the details and focus on your expertise. Of course, if you are a front-end engineer, try to make a side project that is basically something that you know how to do it, and you will have fun doing it. Don't try to create like the next image processing startup out there if you don't have expertise to do it. Only if the only like reason why you could do it would be to learn something new. And that's a really like nice thing to do if you want to, I don't know, like enter on the AI hype right now, for example, on machine learning and etc. If you want to create something with machine learning, neural networks, stuff like that, you can learn a lot from it. Probably that's just a probably like 99% of chance that what we'll create is not that innovative because you don't know the market yet. You're going to learn something, and then after you learn about the environment, then you can think about something new to increment on that market. And the third thing is you have to enjoy it. Don't try to create something that is like boring for you to create, because as the title says, it's a side project. That's not something that you have to like make money on it at first. It's not something that you have to like be the next Mark Zuckerberg in like 2 months. It's something that you have to create to enjoy, and you have to like it. My experience is always that if you do something that you really like doing, it's gonna become something like great in the future. But like, yeah, I already said stuff like that is just something that you find on Twitter, on the like following some people. And I don't really like just the this kind of tip, because it's very like small based on what you can give. Because right, you have to create a side project, you have to like it, you have to create something that you like, and you have to focus on your expertise. All right, that's something that I like hear all the time. But of course, that's not everything that I'm going to say. I'm going to talk a little bit about my stack and how I create stuff for myself, and how I failed like multiple times doing stuff, but I did it like fast. And I discovered fast that it wouldn't work. If you are a Rails developer, please, or a Django developer, or like if you know any other language but not JavaScript, then I'm sorry. I'm gonna talk a little bit about TypeScript and JavaScript in general, because that's my stack. That's what I use to create my side projects, and what I found myself like doing is fast. Because of course, there's going to appear like some Ruby on Rails developer and is going to say like, I can do it in 5 minutes. Yeah, Django developer is going to say the same thing. But I'm going to talk about my environment and what I use. For front end, first of all, I use Next.js. that is basically a framework that has all the good parts of React in one place, and you can create like literally a page with 4 lines. Actually, you can do it in 1 line, but I'm not going to talk about it. You can create it in 1 line if you want to. You can create like several entire e-commerce with like 5 pages, writing, I don't know, like 20 lines of code. And it's very easy to work with a front-end part. So that's why what I found myself using a lot, and what I like to use for my projects on the front-end part. Well, that is another thing that I like to use, is that over the last, I don't know, like 3-4 years, all the companies that I worked at were using AWS. And I think that like all the companies, big ones, unless like it's Microsoft based, is using something like AWS. And I like to create stuff with AWS CDK or Amplify. There are two, they are similar, but they are different in some ways. With AWS CDK, you can create only the backend, and then you can go back and create your front end for the web with Next.js, and your app with Expo in my stack, of course. And it's really easy to create entire backends with GraphQL, and even RESTful APIs. It's very easy. You have to define like your what you want to create. It can configure your DynamoDB for you. It can create everything for you. And it's really like, it has a lot of courses and posts about AWS CDK and how you can create it. It's basically, I don't know the correct name. I think that is environment as a code or something like that. That you basically can define everything outside of the AWS UI. That is something that nobody that I know loves, but everyone has to use it. So you can basically create with technologies that you know. So you can create it with Python, TypeScript, Java, if you know, like you like it, and you can create it with anything you want to. And over the past few months, I've been creating like a very small projects, things that I needed to create like fast to make a proof of concept, to show to someone. For example, a friend of mine had an idea and I liked the idea, but he needed like something really fast, and I had to create it because he promised to show to someone in like 2 weeks. So I had to create like the whole thing in 2 weeks. And when you start to create like a lot of side projects, and you start to create like the same code, so you have the boilerplate that you use for everything. So what I started doing was that I created this repo called Acme that you can just go on GitHub and fork it and use it whatever you want. It's basically monorepo with a library that you can share types, because I use TypeScript, or share functions between back and front end, and a Next.js already configured with everything that I use, and a folder to generate the AWS CDK code. So I can literally create something like really fast just using the GitHub templates. And that's something that you should use. And I found out recently that many of my friends don't know that it exists, and it exists and it's very helpful. You have to create like templates for everything that you do, because you will repeat yourselves every time that you create a new project, because you are the same person and you don't change your stack on everything that you do. So every time you create something new, the stack is the same one. Not always, but usually it's the same one. So you should create a template for it in order to write less code and just do whatever you have to do. I created one for browser extensions too, because I found out that browser extensions are not a very like used market. So it's very easy to create something for like, it's very easy to create a browser extension and get a lot of users, because everybody like uses Chrome or Mozilla or yeah, Firefox. And the API is the same. So to create something like a browser extension to do something that you think that people will like, it's easy and fast if you have a template, because browser extensions, they don't have the same, they don't have like a Create React app or a Create Next app or AWS CDK. You have to generate your code. You have to write like the Webpack configs. You have to generate the whole thing. So I created a template, so I don't have to do it all the time. I just can copy a template and add code there, and it just works. And basically, that's it. Here goes my GitHub and my Twitter if you want to follow me. And the last tip that I want to give, and this is one that I always found myself like talking to people, is to find the right partners. If you want to partner with someone, try to find yourself a person that completes you and not do the same thing as you do, because sometimes you just do the same thing and it's not gonna make sense. And find people that is as passionate about the product as you. And well, that's it. That's all, folks. You can hit me with some questions.
Thanks for this, Pedro. I'm going to do the question of the day that John introduced before. So tabs or spaces?
Oh, God. You know, like, that's funny. I use Prettier on my VS Code. And literally, that's something that since college, I don't care about. I just like hit enter, I press tab, but I think that the Prettier transfers it to spaces at the end of the day. So with the ESLint Prettier world, you don't have to bother about it anymore. They just ended the conversation there.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we have a couple of questions here. So Steve is asking, what is the funnest project that you've worked on and got to some level of finished?
Yeah, sure. That is like one that I really like to do. That was my first time creating the a browser extension that I created, an extension called Work Hard. That's basically a Chrome extension that you list some items and some websites or some keywords. And if you open a tab that has one of those keywords or that website that you posted, it just closes it. And I find it very useful for me because it's very easy to get like distracted with a lot of stuff these days. And I didn't find any browser extension that was just simple to use. I just wanted something that closed the tab for me, not something to show me, all right, you're opening a tab that is not blah, blah, blah. So I created one. And another one was one that I created in college that was, actually, it was even bought by the Federation after that. That was a project to, it was kind of LMS, learning management system for people with disabilities. And as we were in college, everything was fun to do. So we created it with, you know, like React 0.14 and Flask in the backend. And yeah, it was a fun one. It still works today, but with another name. The name that we created for it was Soare. That is kind of sun in some language that some of us like went to in somewhere, and it's still up today. So the main LMS in Brazil for people with disabilities for the federal projects uses Soare. That this is this LMS that we created.
Cool. Another interesting question from Tom Michaelis is, how do you find how do you balance your time between side projects, your work, and your life?
Yeah, that's something that I always hear about. Like, how do you have so much time? Like, sometimes you just have to make choices, right? Your work would not like stop just because you started a side project. And your work can't be deprecated because of a new side project. You have to continue working on that, like at the time that you have to. But the real question is like, what do you do between like 6 p.m., that is my case, I arrive at home at 6 p.m. until like 10, 11, that is when I go to sleep. And then at the morning, I wake up like early and then I have stuff to do. And a lot of people go to like Facebook or Twitter or YouTube and they spend like several hours there and they don't do anything like productive. I'm not saying for you to like stop watching YouTube or stop going to Facebook to see your friends. I'm just saying that like if you spend like 1 hour per day doing a side project, then at the end of a month, that's going to be like something. So you just have to find out like what you do that doesn't make you any good. And there is a lot of social media stuff that doesn't make any good for you. What can you stop doing and what can you start doing to be a little bit more productive?
Cool. What would be an interesting side project you're currently working on?
One that I want to create, and I want to find partners for this one. So if you want to, you can go to this page here, like to one of these, and hit me up. Is to create retrospective and a kind of a Scrum utils website that has like the sprint deck and sprint retrospective all in one place, because every place that I went, you use different tools, and it was kind of hard to find one that was good enough to say to other people to use. So I want to create one. And if you want to be on it, just hit me on these channels. I have part of it done, but 1-2 hours per day. So with more people would be like easier to do it.
Okay. I posted it on the chat so people can click on it. Cool.
All right.
So I'm going to skip Tom for now, just so I can answer someone else. So Missy is asking, what would you suggest a newbie to start with for learning to be a front-end engineer?
All right. This is something that I always hear, and it depends on your skills. If you are more of a technical person or a design person, because the front end these days, it can be like a person can be more technical or more designer. And if you have a design background, build something that is that can be beautiful and with animations and etc. That is not clunky, please. But build something like you can do it. Like create something that you see that, for example, a lot of people use I don't know, like search for an API on these open APIs, and see if something that is there can be showed as something beautiful. Like we have now the how's it called, the company, the SpaceX in NASA. They all have APIs. You can create like flight simulations, like where is the flight and where it is at that moment with front-end technologies, and it's very helpful because I used it a lot in the past few months. So, and if you are more a technical person, try to create something that process data on the front end, like that show graphs or stuff like that. And one nice thing to use is the GitHub API, and stuff with the GitHub API, like create that those dots of the calendar that you coded, etc. That's that's used very much for code interviews, and I know it because I've used it in the past for juniors entering on Gamilytics. That and even on other companies, like create that calendar, or if you are more a designer person, try to replicate what you would like to see on this landing page or something like that. I think that it covers most of the things to do as a junior wanting to be hired.
Cool. So Tommy Kellis says, it sounds like you have a lot of friends with ideas. How often do you say no to them?
Like, I don't know about you guys, but I'm from I live in London. I'm in Brazil now visiting my family because of the whole Corona thing. But I'm from a city of 35,000 people. And that's a very small city in Brazil. And everybody thinks that I am Mark Zuckerberg. So everyone comes with ideas like, I want to create this Uber-like app, or this, I don't know, like next Google with the better search. And I have to say at least once per week, I have to say like, I'm sorry, I don't have time to do it right now. I can talk to some friends if they want to help you with it, but it's not going to be free, and etc. So yeah, the reality in third world countries is very like hard on these ones.
Cool. Okay, so if we have no more questions, I'll pass it on to Jonathan again.
I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
That was a great talk, Pedro. Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen with the picture of Dylan. Everyone see the picture, the slide of Dylan? Good. So obviously the picture has the same background as we see today. So anyway, so Dylan is the organizer of Heartstart conference. Previously worked at SitePen, and it's someone I've known for many years in the JavaScript community. And I've spoken at lots of his conferences and meetups. So now I get to have him speak at my meetup. Yay! So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Dylan. So just give a great talk on the rise of TypeScript.
In many ways, it is a talk about the rise of JavaScript as well. So that makes sense. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm Dylan. I'm based in Arizona, though I lived in London for a few years, so I still have a lot of connections there. I thought I'd give a talk today that's a bit different. It's a bit tech, a bit history, and kind of a bit of like how to predict the future. So I'm one of the creators of Dojo, which is one of the early JavaScript frameworks, which is now a TypeScript framework. I was a CEO at SitePen for nearly 20 years. I help organize TSConf and Halfstack, and I'm also working on a startup called LivingSpec. And what I think is really interesting is it's really easy now to say, hey, like this TypeScript thing, it's kind of big, right? And I just want to make sure I'm actually sharing the right screen, right? Everyone can see like the title slide. Yes?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, cool. And you know, what's interesting is like, well, how did it get popular and why? Because in like 8 years ago, Microsoft was not considered an open source friendly company. So like, why did I decide 8 years ago that TypeScript was a good thing? And I was sort of encouraged to give this talk by a friend who was like, you know, it's weird, like you're right about a lot of things. And I was like, well, what do you mean? And they like sort of rattled off some of these. And it's not that I'm right about everything, but like when I first saw the image tag in the Mosaic browser in '94, I'm like, oh, this web thing's going to be big. And people were like, yeah, why would I use the web when I can go talk to someone in person, or when I can go to the library and read a book? Like that was the kind of feedback I got back then. Or I actually started working with JavaScript in '96, and people would be like, hey, go learn a real language like Java or C or, you know, something like that, right? And I predicted the dot-com bubble in '99, which a lot of people were predicting, but I actually was smart enough to sell off a bunch of equity at the time instead of watching it all crash down the next year. I was really passionate about SVG in 2001, which was about 10 years too soon. But I knew that like the ability to draw natively in a browser was a really big deal. I started a JavaScript framework with a few other people in 2004, which was a really good time to do that. But TypeScript was kind of surprising because I actually had a bad experience with Microsoft prior to that. And so it was not what you would expect. And so I think to sort of understand like why I sort of pick these things really early sometimes is to sort of look at the history of what was needed and where we were at and why this seemed like a really important thing to do. So to do that, you sort of step back to like 99, which is the really early years of JavaScript. There's like the Y2K thing, like party like it's 1999. So here we're going to JavaScript like it's 1999. So at the time JavaScript was established, the browsers on the market were Netscape and IE. There were maybe other attempts, but those were really the two browsers, both browsers in the day, as we called it. And almost as soon as the language was released, all the discussions became, well, how do we fix this thing? How do we make it interesting? So there was this sort of grand vision for JavaScript 2.0, where we would add classes and typing and modifiers and this thing called E4X. And these were all things that were attempts to improve the language. But I like to describe those as JavaScript, where it was basically an attempt to like take all the stuff from Java and shove it into JavaScript. And people were taking the sort of Java part of it way too seriously. And like Google had this thing called GWT or GWT that would actually take Java code and transpile it to JavaScript. And it was great if you wanted to create applications that looked just like Gmail at the time. But otherwise, it was actually fairly difficult to work with. And we had this ES4 thing that was pretty complex, and it was kind of inspired by ActionScript from Flash, kind of inspired by these JavaScript efforts that were going on to make the 2.0 version. And it was championed by Adobe and Mozilla, and Microsoft and a few others kind of just looked at it and were like, this is too complex, this isn't going to work. And really everyone was attempting at the time to turn JavaScript into a real language, and it failed pretty miserably. And so in around 2008, I think if I remember correctly, Brendan Eich and some others got together and they came up with this idea of creating Harmony. And the idea was to create ES5, which kind of standardized what everyone was doing at that time anyway. So basically throw away ES4. It's kind of like the iPhone 9, which never existed, just, they skipped a version number, abandoned it. At the time, CoffeeScript was kind of emerging. It had some fixes for JavaScript. And it was kind of the first time people said, oh, I could write something that's sort of like JavaScript, but I'm going to get some nice syntactic sugar and I'm going to transpile it to JavaScript. So it was kind of like, oh, that's interesting. Like, do I really want to have to transpile to run something? And obviously that's proved to be successful. And honestly, we were still in 2008 and it was going to be 7 more years before ES6 would finally be released and finished. So it was a long process to try to get back some of these things that were proposed as early as 2000 or 1999. So you're probably like, hey, Dylan, like I thought we were talking about TypeScript, like what's going on? And really what I'm just trying to do is like set the stage for the world in which TypeScript was born. Because a lot of the early thorns and challenges of TypeScript were the fact that it started before ES6 was a thing. So they adopted some concepts and they extended the language a bit in ways that were not compatible with what ES6 would end up doing. And a lot of the early perceptions were kind of like, oh, well, this is like a fork of JavaScript or a different language, rather than sort of aligning with the standards and adding the things that were needed. But that was born out of necessity before certain things were standardized into the language. And a lot of people, myself and teams at Microsoft and teams at a lot of other organizations, were trying to build very large applications with JavaScript. And it was really challenging because the language was not designed for it. And people, when they first hear about TypeScript, they think, oh, well, I got to define types like strings and numbers. And while that may be true, a lot of that can be inferred automatically. But what's really interesting about TypeScript to me, and what got me first interested in it, was the idea of interfaces. Because early in the days, I had tried to work on like a compatibility layer between Dojo and jQuery, or at least our Dojo team had tried to do this. And it was really difficult because there was no clearly defined interface for what jQuery provided and what it was. And the consequence of that was like every time jQuery upgraded, they would break something in a subtle way, not necessarily intentional, but just there's a lot of different ways you can use an undocumented dynamic API that doesn't have a lot of restrictions or definitions. So, we always talk about like working with APIs, but JavaScript, it's actually really difficult to express the intent of your code or the API that you're working with. So TypeScript like forces you to do some stuff to describe definitions and interfaces or to types. But what that does, it allows you to describe the code you've built, which is really interesting. And then you get a bunch of nice things on top of that related to interoperability and other niceties to have. But what also is kind of cool about that is just that then you can start to like realize that TypeScript's not trying to replace JavaScript. It's trying to provide interfaces and types for JavaScript. And there have been many other languages that have come along that have tried to replace JavaScript, and such as Dart or other things. And they haven't really succeeded on the web because inevitably they're trying to change or replace this language that we all love, or whether we love it or not, like we all use it for the web. And one of the reasons TypeScript is actually kind of challenging to do and to make it really nice is that it is trying to do a type system that supports all the common ways that we use JavaScript in the world. And that's pretty interesting and challenging. So fast forward a bit, we're still in 2010, it's still like 10 years ago, which is hard to believe. And this is where you might expect me to show a picture of Anders Heilsberg, who's known for Turbo Pascal and Delphi and C# and TypeScript. But it turns out Anders wasn't actually the original creator of TypeScript. He just joined the project fairly early. And so what was going on is there was the Chakra team, these two people on the team, Steve Lucco and Luke Hogan, and they were tasked with coming up with an idea for managing large JavaScript code bases. At the time, there were a lot of different things at Microsoft that were starting to grow in size that were web projects, and they wanted to do something interesting. So they came up with this project called Strata, and I'm not sure how the name Strata first started. I've actually done a lot of interviews to try to find out information that's kind of not publicly known, which is kind of cool. But at the time, there was Bing Maps, and Microsoft Office had a bunch of JavaScript extensions, and Visual Studio is trying to support JavaScript, and not really Clippy, but Clippy's kind of fun. And I like that version of Clippy. And what was happening is there were like VPs in Office at the Microsoft team, and they were trying to rapidly transition their development teams from C++ or C# over to JavaScript. And they were missing the productivity and confidence that type systems of those languages had. And the Visual Studio IDE had provided those for other languages, but it was not really able to do that for JavaScript at the time. But JavaScript was emerging as this language where people were building substantial applications, and yet they were missing the productivity features they had. And so at the time, there were several options available. There was CoffeeScript, which we already talked about. There was something called Script Sharp that was worked on internally at Microsoft. I think it was announced publicly, but it never really took off. But there was a bit of an impedance mismatch, if you were trying to get like teams working together and working in the same language. Also, what was kind of interesting at the time is there was Google's Clojure compiler, which is what this logo is on the right, I think. And basically, the Clojure compiler was just a Java-based compiler that would allow you to transpile JavaScript. And a lot of JavaScript projects used it. Dojo used it, and others as sort of a precursor to Webpack and Babel and things like that. But it allowed you to do some minification, some code mods, and it caught and reported type-based errors, which was kind of interesting. Even though most people didn't use it in that way, it was possible. And so there's just a lot of different interesting things going on. So the team at Microsoft sort of came up with a few founding principles for this Strata project. They wanted a language as similar as possible to JavaScript, in very few additions or changes. They wanted type checking, and they wanted to support rich tooling. And one of the lessons learned sort of on the history of programming is like, why do people hate Java in the JavaScript community or in a lot of communities? And it's often not that it's Java, it's often that it's a slow experience in an IDE, that they haven't, at least early on, they didn't couple the developer experience and performance with the language features they were adding. So the sort of joke was like, as you're typing in Eclipse, like you're watching the compiler think instead of like working at the speed that you can work. And they didn't want to repeat that behavior. So they had a big internal conference at Microsoft in February of 2011. And this was, there's like no public info on this that I've found other than like maybe a blog post or two here and there. But it was kind of interesting. Like they're supposed to present this thing they'd been working on. And Steve, who was the only engineer on the project, had a wrist injury, so he couldn't actually write code for a while, and he was supposed to be hacking on it. So Luke kind of hacked something together without actually having a compiler, and he described it as like slightly better than Vaporware, which is kind of funny. And the first users of this team that were working on it would become the later VS Code team. And so I think it's kind of fun to look at the first demo code that's been shared. And so if we look at this code, it's kind of funny. The first thing you realize up top is that there is jQuery. So they actually used jQuery in this demo just to like, I don't know why, like they just did it because it was a true like Vaporware type thing. There were some implicit flow types through the code without the need for annotation. So you can kind of just see like some implicit typing. So they didn't have to define things explicitly. But then they also had some like this weird sort of class syntax that was sort of based on F# at the time, this like functional syntax. They kind of moved away from that. They also moved away from this concept of having like a the type as a prefix instead of a suffix, because that didn't really work well with how JavaScript parsers work and so on. But a lot of it is actually pretty similar to what they do today. So you look at it and you're like, well, that's kind of like TypeScript, but it's not really, but it is similar enough. But they also made it work that like you could use plain JavaScript in this system from day one. And my understanding is that Anders was there on day one, and he was impressed enough or interested enough that he ended up leaving the C# team and joining the TypeScript team shortly thereafter to work on it. And so they went from sort of this side project interpreter that used Clojure compiler comments to pull this all together. Somehow the parser was hosted in Silverlight, like to make it run fast enough in a browser. So they demoed it like in a browser environment. And then they sort of had this live error reporting that worked through script tags as there was like this background type checker running in the browser. So it was like this really weirdly hacked together thing by a non-engineer to show a demo of something that could work that was impressive enough that people at Microsoft Research were like, oh, this could be really big. This could actually really work. So that was February 2011. Fast forward like 18 months, and there's a blog post announcing TypeScript. And Anders has a talk, and there's like a little video. And the comments on this post are priceless. I mean, they're like, Scott Kuhn, I don't know Scott Kuhn, but he's just like, this is the dumbest idea ever. And you're like, oh, that's cool. It's almost as bad as the comments about React when that first came out, which was also equally deadpanned as well. This other person, Derek Bailey, is like, this is bad or worse than Dart. Like, all right. Like, it seems that Anders hates languages that aren't statically typed. And actually, it's not true at all. Anders loves very functional languages, but he's basically surprised that like people thought that about him, because what he's really just trying to do is actually add the ability to add interfaces and types to a language. Hold on one second. Hey, I'm on a conference call, okay? Thanks, bye. My son is 6 years old and doing homeschool right now. So there was also, I have to talk to you later. Thank you. I will lock the door now.
It's okay, Dylan.
It's all good. It's what makes it fun and live and real, right? So, anyway, so then like there's why another JS plus X language? It's kind of funny they use the phrase JS plus X because obviously JSX came out roughly the same time. It was kind of nice coincidence. And there was like one comment on the thread originally that was like, oh, this is actually like a really good idea. I like this, and I actually saw it. And to be honest, when I first saw this, I was a little skeptical, but I keep an open mind to things because I don't assume that I know everything. So a few days later, they were at JSConf EU and they gave a talk about this. And it was like, if you look at it, it's like just a really low production quality talk. Like JSConf EU was kind of a small thing. And last time I checked, this video had 15 likes and a couple of comments. And I think the reason no one has noticed it is because they misspelled Anders' surname and like the talk like metadata. So people just don't find it. I don't know how they don't find it, but like, it's like the most underwatched talk for like the thing that kicked off a major change in the language. So since that time, a lot has changed. And what you'll notice is like the first 2 or 3 years, and this is just the Google Trends chart on top. The first 2 or 3 years was pretty quiet. And frankly, it's because TypeScript wasn't really done. It was like good enough that it showed promise, but it was not like something you would use to create a framework at the time. It needed a lot of work. And what you also notice is kind of that inflection point starts around the time ES6 was done. So the sort of, it was kind of just a little bit ahead of its time with the public release. But what you'll also notice is it like popped onto language popularity charts, and it's now considered like a top 10 programming language on its own, in addition to JavaScript, which is pretty shocking. I mean, I thought it would do well, but I never quite expected it to be as well received as it is today. So my personal history, before I sort of go into like the full history of TypeScript since then, In 2004, I was working on a project with Alex Russell, a predecessor to Dojo, called NetWindows. And Microsoft's lawyers decided to send every open source project with the word Windows in it a cease and desist order, except even though X Windows predated Microsoft Windows. And so we changed our project name and we started a new project called Dojo. But we kind of had some bad blood from that relationship because we didn't have money to defend a lawsuit over a name that had nothing to do with Microsoft Windows. So then, you know, this thing came out from Microsoft, like, open source software from Microsoft. That's funny. That's cute. Because to date, they'd had like these fake open source licenses called like the Microsoft shared source, which really meant like Microsoft owned everything except when they chose not to. But then I was in spring of 2013, so just a few months later, people kept asking me about it. So I was at a conference for ESRI, which is a big map technology company. And like, hey, have you checked out TypeScript? We're considering using it. I'm like, oh, really? And then one of my fellow engineers at SitePen was like, hey, we should start using TypeScript. And I was like, all right, like, convince me. And he basically showed me the benefits of it. And I was pretty quickly on board, but it still took us about 6 months to say, let's rewrite Dojo using TypeScript, which then became like a 5-year process to basically start over and start over again. And kind of one of the highlights for me was in summer of 2017, I was invited up to Microsoft and met the team, and Anders made time for us. And we just got to talk about what we needed. And it was really amazing experience because usually when you're invited to a session like that, my experience is like, yeah, you're there, but like, we're going to tell you what to think. And but they made compilers feel accessible to me. And like, I'm not a compiler person, but like the team knew how to communicate in a way that really made things approachable. And at lunch, they were like asking me like, how do you work remotely? And I was like, well, that's like so obvious. Like, I've been doing it for 10 years. But for them, it was like this new concept because they all work together in an office, at least until this year, obviously. So it was just a really nice meeting. And so in the early years of TypeScript, like, there's a lot of promise, but the interest was kind of muted. And frankly, the compiler needed a lot of work. There was a quote somewhere about how generics probably weren't a good idea, but without generics, TypeScript would be impossible to define. But kind of the point when TypeScript became a real open source project to me is when they moved to GitHub. And obviously this is years before Microsoft would acquire GitHub. At the time they had something called Codeplex, which was kind of where all the fake open source projects went to live. But the switch to GitHub, I think, is kind of the point where people started to say, oh, Microsoft's actually going to do a real open source project here. This is pretty interesting. And between like 2012 and 2014, I think they rewrote the compiler like 2 or 3 times pretty significantly. And I think the world started to notice TypeScript around 1.4, because that is when the Angular team started to collaborate with the Microsoft team and say, let's not create our own fork of TypeScript, but let's improve TypeScript enough that Angular could use it and make it work. So Angular announced their switch to TypeScript around spring of 2015. TypeScript 1.5 had support for experimental decorators because Angular was doing this annotation-like thing, which is very similar. And then what was interesting is they just kept iterating on features that were important. And what they were stopping doing was really extending the language. They got involved with TC39. They started implementing all the ES6 features that were missing from TypeScript to date. And they basically said, we're not going to invent new language features. Like, we've already got too many. We want to remove as many of them as possible, but we don't want to compete with the language that's being defined, that's going in a direction that is aligned with TypeScript. And so then the next couple of years, it really became sort of mainstream popular, like Angular 2 shipped, which was kind of the first big framework that shipped with TypeScript support. Honestly, it was pretty rough. I think Angular 2 probably should have been called Alpha rather than Beta or Final. And it was a few years really before that became finalized. And part of that is ES6 was a huge change, and then TypeScript was a huge change. So to think that you would know like the full ergonomics of a complex application framework 6 months to a year after those frameworks had been finalized is pretty optimistic, right? Because we didn't know like how people would actually use arrow functions. In 2015, everyone said, that's horrible. Why would you ever use that? And now arrow functions are like something we're used to and we're comfortable with. So there was a point also where we felt like TypeScript wasn't quite ready. But with TypeScript 2.2, we were able to say, okay, this mostly works for Dojo. Now we can rewrite Dojo for like the 20th time and find a nice framework approach that works. So then, we're 5 years after TypeScript's first been announced. And at this point, the release cadence improved. And I should step back a little bit. There was a stretch around 1.4 where TypeScript hadn't said anything or released anything in like 6 months. And I wrote kind of a nasty email because we had made the commitment to like fully reinvest, building Dojo on top of TypeScript. And I was like, are you guys going to fix your stuff? Like, or do we need to fork TypeScript? And I didn't mean it like seriously, but I'm like, but it kind of like inspired them to like get more public with their plans. And it turned out they were doing a major rewrite of their compiler. So of course they were kind of quiet about it. But at that point forward, I mean, I'd like to think I had at least a small part of them becoming much more public with their roadmap and much more regular and consistent with their releases. Because prior to that, it was kind of a black box, which wasn't how I would normally run an open source project. And today, I think they're one of the best JavaScript communities out there in terms of, or open source communities out there in terms of communicating with users, setting a clear intention, having a predictable roadmap, knowing what's going on, and so on. So they've made a lot of small improvements over the years, but every release, like the joke is TypeScript doesn't follow semantic versioning because every version will break you in some new way. And that's intentional because what they're trying to do is help you fix different problems that you didn't identify as possible issues before. So for the language to become more and more useful, it has to keep adding new features that would potentially break you. In March of 2018 was the first TSConf. That was a pretty awesome event. And that's also when Stencil was introduced, which is a really nice TypeScript-based web component generator or framework that helps you build components across frameworks. Dojo 2 finally shipped. We didn't take quite as long as Duke Nukem Forever or other games that took like 5 to 10 years or 15 years to be produced, but we wanted to be sort of this TypeScript first framework that was really ergonomic and efficient. And like if you squint, we look like a React based, like a TypeScript version of React that kind of combines things together. In many ways, Next and Dojo are fairly similar in their depth and breadth. The only difference is that Dojo kind of controls the entire layer a bit more so that the framework can actually work with components a bit more efficiently, in our opinion. And so when TypeScript 3 came out, that was a big performance improvement for bigger projects. And that was kind of the point in time where, again, TypeScript would have another inflection point in terms of adoption and usage. And then shortly thereafter, Vue announced they're going to rewrite in TypeScript. And like Dojo, that's been a long slog. I mean, they're 2 years in and still haven't shipped. Babel 7 supported TypeScript. Create React Apps started adding support for TypeScript. Svelte Svelte 3 was rewritten in TypeScript. And so a lot of projects and framework authors were finding this is really nice because guess what? Like we can define interfaces for what we're building. So that's why it's particularly useful. There are a lot of other interesting things happened. And this is kind of the point in time when like the survey results went from like, I haven't tried it, so I'm going to use it. And for whatever reason, like winter break 2018, my Twitter stream was filled with like never TypeScripters suddenly saying, I tried TypeScript and I love it. And so like Mike Sharov was like just shocked that like, wow, like this is like something magical that actually fixes my code for me and lets me refactor. And the like thought space around like people I knew and respected in the JavaScript ecosystem who had dismissed it before suddenly were like, oh, wow, this is kind of cool. Maybe I should be doing this. Then over the past couple of years, just a lot more features have happened. The second TSConf happened. Jest switched from Flow to TypeScript internally, which shocked a lot of people because Flow was kind of the main contender for TypeScript at the time. A lot of features like that finally fixed some complex things like knowledge coalescing support was and optional chaining was something that the TypeScript team helped work on, and they were one of the first people to implement it. And then they actually championed the private field support, which is kind of cool. They put a lot of work into that. I think that was the first feature that TypeScript team collaborating with Bloomberg actually went to TC39 and championed the spec and worked through all the issues from kind of the stage 0 to stage 4 process, which is pretty cool. And then this year, I mean, obviously it's a year of COVID, so things are a little more muted in general. TSConf is going to be online, but 4.0 just came out, I think it was last week, so it's pretty recent. And also very recently, it was announced that Svelte, while it was written in TypeScript before, it was still difficult to use with TypeScript without having to pull together like 20 different extensions. But a couple of the engineers in the TypeScript team worked with Svelte to improve the TypeScript support. So there's a lot going on, right? And so they're kind of constantly releasing things based on feedback, based on performance, based on people complaining, and they just kind of keep working every couple months to make the language better and the experience better. So really a lot has changed in the 7 years since it was announced, or maybe 8 years, and like the 9 to 10 years it's been worked on. Perceptions mostly went from being really negative to being, depending on the survey, like the second or third most loved programming language out there. And I think a huge amount of that is due to the care and attention the TypeScript team took to engage the ecosystem, delivering features within IDEs that are fast. Like Anders will not implement a feature in TypeScript or refuses to consider it if you can't find a way to make it as fast as you can type. And so that's a pretty important, and by type, I mean typing with your hands, not defining type definitions. And so, while Scott Kuhn's quote is probably going to go down in infancy, and I'd be curious to, or infamy, I'd be curious to see what he thinks today. That's kind of gone up in flames. And now, like, this is serious loved programming language. It's pretty impressive that it's happened. And a lot of it is like their true open source project. They've created an open and transparent roadmap. They're very engaged with the community. They truly have not tried to replace, which was Microsoft was known for like embrace, extend, extinguish. And they so far, and like from all we can tell, that's not the plan. And they've really taken care to make sure that they add features people want and in the way people would use. And so like, because TypeScript fixed a problem I saw in JavaScript, I was impressed and I thought it was going to be very useful. I knew it had lots of issues and lots of warts that needed to be worked on, but it seemed like a good project. So like looking back, I mean, it seemed like it was a bet, but it was a bet based on I have this problem and this pain point and this need. And it's amazing that someone's trying to solve it in a way that's consistent with the way JavaScript works, rather than trying to solve it in a way that is like, let's create a new language and let's just replace JavaScript. Because like that's the situation where you fix 5 problems and introduce 20 new ones by not really thinking through everything that a language does that's as powerful as JavaScript and its place within the web ecosystem. So that is it. So thank you. And I would love to hear your questions, and thanks.
Thank you very much, Dylan. Obviously, the first question has to be, how is teaching your son TypeScript going?
We actually got a Johnny 5 Inventors Kit recently, which sort of uses Tessel and Node, and we've started with JavaScript, obviously. About his most excitement, he's 6. His most excitement with JavaScript right now is this Lego JavaScript thing I built for him.
Oh, cool.
And you can do this with TS and whatnot. Yeah. But we've been spending an hour or so each Sunday just kind of trying to get sensors to light up and measure things. And I kind of try and walk it through him. I think mostly right now he's excited about making YouTube videos about it. But I figure eventually it'll stick. But I have this photo of him when he was 2 years old, hacking on my computer, he was actually contributing to Dojo. But nice. I think he's pretty interested in the results. He's just not interested in the work to get the results yet.
Yeah, but my kid's got this Lego Boost thing.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. Yeah. I was expecting the tabs versus spaces question first.
Oh, last second. It's all right. Your son interrupted your talk, so that became more important. So, tabs versus spaces.
Well, obviously the troll answer is 3 space indentation, but not really. So, ignoring all the technical legacy reasons for why spaces are better, and obviously you can configure prettier to however you want. So for my open source stuff that I work on with Dojo, we use tabs. And the reason I prefer tabs, if I have a prettier configuration, I show tabs in my IDE. And then I just, if I have to contribute back to spaces, it'll get handled for me with a commit hook or whatever. Because on different screens, I want a different depth of indentation. And so sometimes I'm working at sort of a different aspect angle. And so if I'm on a pretty small screen on my laptop, I want my indentation as tight as possible. But right now at home, I have a 49-inch screen, so I kind of want some depth. And so when I use tabs, I can actually configure the distance, the width of my tab more easily than I can configure the width of a space. So there's actual a usability reason for me. I find it more readable when it's wider, when it's on a bigger screen.
Cool.
But prettier is of course the answer. So, but you can configure prettier, which is what people you can set tabs in prettier if you want to.
But how do you handle pull request reviews with the whole tabs? So never mind. TypeScript is owned by Microsoft. Do you think it might be better placed if it was run by OpenJS Foundation?
I feel like they have done everything right in treating it like a real open source project. So a lot of times a foundation emerges because, like, why did Node create the Node Foundation, which then merged with the OpenJS Foundation? Because there was actual conflict and ownership issues and trust issues. And like the IP was technically sold by Ryan Dahl to Joyent, which was kind of weird. And so there were forks of the project and real tension from progress or lack thereof. And that hasn't happened in TypeScript to date. So it hasn't been an issue, but like open source foundations are supposed to be there to solve those problems. Now that said, like Microsoft contributes a lot of effort and time to the foundation. So it doesn't mean they won't do it someday, but it just hasn't been a problem. So I guess what I'm trying to say is like foundations are there to sort of help you when you have a problem, or maybe a little bit before you have a problem, but they've had so few problems that I wouldn't say it's like a necessity, but it's certainly an option if they want to consider it.
Very cool.
Yeah.
What kinds of apps do you think of TypeScript is better for building? I.e., when would you choose TypeScript over JavaScript or JavaScript over TypeScript?
I mean, I tend to never really get involved with anything small. So I almost always use TypeScript because you never really know where it's going to go. And I mean, the thing is, you end up with JavaScript that is similar to what you would write by hand anyway. So you could always drop it. And you know, if you use allow.js as a configuration option in your TypeScript, you can just write plain JavaScript and use the TypeScript tools to sort of give you some suggestions on how to make your code better anyway. So I don't really see it as having to be a decision anymore. Whereas it used to be like, okay, if you want to use TypeScript, you got to upgrade your whole code base and use it, or you got to be strict with your types. But now you really can just like incrementally adopt it as you need to. I find I can never remember why I did something 6 months earlier. So like just having the interface definitions really saves me time from reasoning about what I did. So for me, it's just like a memory tool more than anything else.
Cool. So as he's on this call, I have a colleague who thinks that using TypeScript will slow him down. What would you say in response to this argument and to argue against that?
I mean, at first, anything new slows you down. So when you switched from ES5 to ES6, I'm sure you were slowed down a lot. I actually had a colleague who was first working with us on Dojo. And he's like, I hate all these new features in TypeScript. I'm like, oh, what do you hate? And he's like, well, I hate arrow functions and I hate like this and I hate that. And it turned out everything he hated was actually ES6 features that he wasn't familiar with. And so what I'm reminded of is a lot of it is familiarity. Now, there are certain cases where it's difficult to describe an API and what it's doing. And at that point in time, you kind of make one of three decisions. You decide, like, this is really important. We better figure out the right way to describe it through an interface or a type definition. You decide you don't care and you just throw in any type on it, which is kind of what some people do. Or you realize that maybe this isn't the right way to write this API. Maybe there's a cleaner way to describe it that's easier to describe. So maybe I don't want like the full flexibility JavaScript wants because people aren't going to be able to understand what I did. So there's sort of this thought that like there are certain things that are difficult to describe with TypeScript because they're bad ideas. And all three of those answers are right depending on the scenario. And you just have to like decide when you care. But like if you really don't want to write TypeScript, like you could still use the allow.js flag and it would still tell you things about your JavaScript code that maybe you could improve. So it's not like you have to like fully embrace TypeScript and like how to like perfectly generic tuple variadic whatevers and like, you know, do like complex generic statements to like describe in infinite detail how your type definitions work. You could skip all that, but you could still get some benefit from the productivity tools they've provided.
Cool. To what extent do you think types reduce the need for unit tests?
There's a class of things where you're trying to determine if something is the type you expected, or where you're trying to like make sure that you're not doing like weird things you shouldn't be doing that TypeScript kind of gets rid of, because it is effectively like TypeScript is a linting tool, a testing tool, and a way to describe interfaces. And most of that is masked in the form of some language features, and then a whole bunch of compiler and language and build tools behind the scenes. So like to think of it as just like a new language or an addition to the language, actually the fact that there are any language additions or features are just there because like you can't do those things with normal JavaScript. but most of the benefit is actually not the syntax. Most of it is the tooling and process behind it.
Okay, cool. I think it's the last question. So what do you think are TypeScript's weaknesses and what would you improve?
I think that there are still some obscure things that are difficult. So all right, so like 3 or 4 years, or maybe 6 years ago now, they're like some of the earliest TypeScript issues were around this concept of variadic kinds, which is how you describe like basically higher order functional programming constructs. And the challenge originally behind those is they're really hard to describe something that's like infinitely functional, which is what you would get into. And Anders describes this as like turtles all the way down. And like if you go too many levels deep, your compiler starts to get really slow. So most compilers cheat and they go like 10 levels down, but there are certain things where that doesn't quite work. And so what they've been doing over the past couple of years is kind of chipping away at those problems and like figuring out like, okay, how do I describe this kind of like the variadic tuple implementation in TypeScript 4 was one of those big additions where before it was like this ugly set of like nested overloaded constructors. And now it's like a nice single generic that describes like, if you take 2 arrays and merge them together into a single array using concat, that's actually really hard to describe a flexible type definition for it. So there are still a handful of things like that that are a lot of like, you know, like Ramda or other sort of functional libraries use that are hard to do. Like Lodash was particularly hard to type in TypeScript. And still, I think it's better now, but there's still some things you can't efficiently type. So that's kind of where it is. And then really just once in a while, you just run into something where you're like, I don't get what this error is. Their error messages have gotten a lot better over the years, but there's still some cases where you're just trying to wrap your head around like what's going on, and that can be challenging. But I think that's true regardless of like it's just complex code that's hard to describe at times.
Cool. Well, thank you very much for your talk, Dylan.
Thank you.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I'm sure everyone who goes to JSConf will enjoy it as well.
Thanks.
Cool. I'm just going to get the slides up again. Before I get the slides up, we had also 5 tickets to give away for FemTechConf. We only had 3 people enter, so all 3 people get the ticket. Yay! So those are Mincy Yang, Thomas Hopkins, who's watching on, I believe, watching on YouTube, and Anita, who tweeted us as well. So I will message you all offline about how we can sort those tickets out for you. We'll be doing more tickets on our Twitter account soon anyway. So thank you very much for your time this evening. I'm just going to share my screen. Where are they? So first, thank you to our speakers. We had Natalie, Pedro, and Dylan. All gave us great talks. And thanks to our sponsor, RVU, who allow us to plan these things during work hours and stuff, and provide us with Zoom and stuff. Yep. So with that, thank you very much, and hope you all have a lovely evening.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for doing this, Dylan.
Of course. Thank you. It was fun.